Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be diving deep into one of the most pivotal moments in American history, the
Mm,
Battle of Gettysburg. You guys have sent us some incredible material to cover this time,
yes.
and including an excerpt from the History That Doesn't Suck podcast, which tells the story of Joseph Wesley Culp, a Gettysburg native who ended up fighting for the Confederacy.
Right.
And can you imagine the internal turmoil of fighting against your own hometown? Potentially even your own brother.
It is really hard to wrap your head around. It adds such a personal dimension to this epic battle. And it's just a reminder that in these large-scale conflicts, individual lives were completely and irrevocably changed. Families were torn apart. People were just faced with impossible choices.
Really makes you think about the human cost of war in a whole new way.
Absolutely.
So before we get into Wes Culp's story,
Mhm.
let's set the stage for the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay. So it's May 1863. The Civil War has been raging for 2 long years. The Confederate Army is in desperate need of supplies, and they've set their sights on Pennsylvania.
Which seems a bit random to me.
Yeah, it wasn't random at all. They were hoping to deliver a strategic blow to the Union. A successful invasion could really demoralize the Union, sway public opinion, and maybe even get some European recognition.
Wow, so they were really playing for high stakes.
Oh, absolutely high stakes.
Meanwhile, on the Union side, things aren't exactly smooth sailing either. General Joe Hooker had resigned just days before the battle,
Yeah,
unhappy with the lack of support from Lincoln.
that's right. And that's where George Meade steps in. A man known for his fiery temper. He was even called Old Snapping Turtle. Oh, wow. Yeah, and he took command of the Army of the Potomac just days before Gettysburg.
Oh my gosh, talk about pressure.
Yeah, just thrown right into the fire. So how did these two armies end up in Gettysburg? Was it a planned confrontation or...
No, not exactly. More of a chance encounter, really. You see, Confederate General Harry Heth was sent to Gettysburg to scout out the Union troops. He was specifically ordered to avoid a full-blown engagement.
So basically, don't start a fight.
Exactly. But as we often see in history, things rarely go according to plan. Heth ended up engaging with Union cavalry under John Buford. And that's how the Battle of Gettysburg began.
Wow, so it's kind of a historical accident that spiraled into the largest battle of the Civil War.
It really is.
So this accidental clash sets the stage for a battle that'll change the course of the war.
Yeah.
And right here in this volatile setting is where we find Wes Culp.
Yes, and just before the fighting begins, Culp gets a pass to visit his sisters who are still living in Gettysburg. Can you imagine the emotional weight of that reunion? Knowing he'd be fighting against his hometown the very next day?
And potentially his brother.
Potentially his own brother.
I mean, that's just heartbreaking.
It really is.
The source material you sent also mentions that Culp made a promise to his sisters during this visit.
He did. He promised to deliver a message to the mother of a Union soldier named Jack Skelly, whom he befriended at an earlier battle. He told his sisters he knew Jack's regiment would be at Gettysburg, and if he saw him, he would check on him for them.
Wow. It's incredible how these stories of human connection emerge
I know.
in the midst of all this brutality.
Amidst all the brutality.
So we have the stage set. Two armies on a collision course, a town caught in the crossfire, and a young man wrestling with divided loyalties. Let's move on to July 1st, 1863, the day the first shots are fired.
Okay. On that day, Confederate and Union troops clashed just west of Gettysburg. Both sides were fighting for control of the ridges that overlook the town. Those ridges offered crucial high ground, and whoever held them would have a significant advantage in the battle to come.
So it's all about the high ground, kind of like a king of the hill situation.
Exactly. And right from the start, the Union suffered a major loss. General John Reynolds, one of their most capable commanders, was killed early in the fighting.
Wow, that must have been a devastating blow to the Union Army.
It was. However, Reynolds' quick thinking earlier in the day had helped secure Cemetery Hill, which would become a crucial defensive position for the Union Army later in the battle.
So even in death, his actions had a significant impact on the course of the battle.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what happens next?
Well, despite fierce resistance, the Union troops were gradually pushed back through the town of Gettysburg. They didn't break, though, thanks to General Otis Howard. They were able to make a strategic retreat to Cemetery Hill south of the town.
So it's a retreat, but a calculated one. They're falling back to a more defensible position.
Exactly. It was a brilliant tactical maneuver
Right.
that would have significant consequences for the rest of the battle.
So by the end of day one, the Confederates hold the town of Gettysburg. But the Union Army is dug in on the high ground south of the town, ready to defend their position.
Exactly. It was a tense standoff, and both sides knew that the real fighting was just beginning.
And what about West Culp? Where does he fit into all of this?
He's out there somewhere fighting for a cause that pits him against everything he knows and loves. His story, along with the stories of so many others, will continue to unfold as we delve deeper into the battle. In the next part of our deep dive,
I can't wait.
as we move into day 2 at Gettysburg, the battle lines really solidify. And those defensive positions we talked about last time, they become crucial. The Union line formed what's often described as a fishhook shape, anchored on 2 hills, Culp's Hill and Little Round Top.
Okay, fishhook shape. What did that look like on the battlefield?
Well, imagine the Union line like a giant backward question mark. The curved part of the hook was along Cemetery Ridge, and the barb of the hook was Little Round Top. This shape gave them a couple key advantages. They could shift troops along the line more easily to reinforce any weaker points, and they could concentrate their firepower on wherever the Confederates attacked.
So it's all about strategy and using the terrain to maximize their strength.
Exactly. Now, as the Confederates launch their attacks on day 2, the fighting is fierce all along the line. But there are 2 key areas that really stand out. Culp's Hill, which we've already mentioned, and Little Round Top at the other end of the fishhook.
Okay, let's talk about Culp's Hill first. You mentioned earlier that this is where West Culp's story comes to an end.
Sadly, it is. A fighting on Culp's Hill was particularly brutal. And remember, this is where Culp's own family lived. He knew this terrain like the back of his hand, which must have made the experience all the more harrowing.
I can only imagine the emotions he must have been going through, fighting on the land where he grew up, knowing that his family is just so close by.
It's just a stark reminder of the personal tragedies that unfolded within this larger event. And as the fighting intensified on Culp's Hill, West Culp was killed, never getting the chance to deliver that message to Mrs. Skelly.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that behind the statistics and behind the names of the battles, there are real people with families and friends and lives that were cut way too short.
Absolutely. And while this personal tragedy was unfolding on Culp's Hill, at the other end of the Union line, a different kind of drama was playing out. This is where we encounter General Dan Sickles, a figure who's both fascinating and controversial.
Yeah, Sickles. You mentioned he was a bit of a maverick. What happened?
Well, Sickles was commanding troops positioned along Cemetery Ridge, a key part of that Union defense. But he decided against direct orders from Meade to move his troops forward to a peach orchard. He believed it was better ground, offering a wider field of fire.
I can't imagine Meade was happy about that.
Oh, he was furious. Meade recognized the danger immediately. Sickles had created a gap in the line, a vulnerability that the Confederates could exploit. But it was too late to pull Sickles back.
So they were stuck dealing with the consequences of Sickles' decision. What happened next?
The Confederates saw that opening, and they attacked. And this led to some of the most intense fighting of the entire battle, particularly around this little hill called Little Round Top.
And that's where Joshua Chamberlain and Strong Vincent really make their mark right.
They do. Little Round Top was absolutely crucial to the Union defense. If the Confederates had taken that hill, they could have flanked the entire Union line, potentially changing the course of the battle.
Wait, flanked. Explain that to me like I'm 5.
Okay, imagine you're standing in a line with your friends, facing another group of people. If someone sneaks around behind you and attacks from the side, they've flanked you. It's a way of getting around the enemy's defenses and attacking them from a more vulnerable position.
Got it. So the Confederates taking Little Round Top would have been really bad news.
Very bad news. And that's where Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Regiment come in. They were tasked with defending the far left flank of that Union line, right there on the slopes of Little Round Top.
And they were outnumbered, right?
Significantly, they faced wave after wave of Confederate attacks, and they were running out of ammunition.
So what do they do? Surrender.
No, they did something much more daring. When they ran out of bullets, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge, a desperate all-out assault down the hill, right into those charging Confederates.
A bayonet charge? I can't even imagine. That must have been terrifying.
It was an incredibly risky move, but it worked. The sheer audacity of that charge took the Confederates by surprise. They broke ranks, fled back down the hill. Chamberlain and the 20th Maine held the line. They saved Little Round Top and prevented a Confederate breakthrough.
Wow, that is a real turning point in the battle. What about Strong Vincent? What was his role in all this?
Strong Vincent, and yes, that is his real name, was a brigade commander who played a key role in securing Little Round Top earlier in the day. He recognized the strategic importance of that hill, even before Sickles moved his troops forward, and he rushed his men to the top just in time to beat the Confederates there.
So he had the foresight to see what was coming.
He did. He was a brilliant young officer. Sadly, he was mortally wounded later that day. But his quick thinking and decisive actions were instrumental in the Union victory at Little Round Top.
It's amazing how these individual stories of courage and sacrifice really shape the course of the battle. And while all this fighting is going on, there's also that story of Tilly Pierce, that young girl who was caught right in the middle of it all.
Tilly's story is a powerful reminder that war doesn't just affect the soldiers on the battlefield. Civilians, especially those living near battle sites, often found themselves right in the crossfire, witnessing the horrors of war firsthand.
Right, you mentioned she helped tend to the wounded soldiers in a farmhouse that was turned into a makeshift hospital. What was that experience like for her?
Imagine being a teenager, surrounded by the sights and sounds of battle, the constant roar of cannons, the cries of the wounded, just the overwhelming sense of fear and uncertainty. That was Tilly's reality.
That must have been so traumatic. Did she ever talk about what she saw and experienced?
She did. Later in life, she wrote about her experience at Gettysburg, and her accounts are both harrowing and inspiring. She described the chaos, the constant stream of wounded soldiers being brought to the farmhouse, and just the tireless efforts of those who cared for them.
So in the midst of all this horror, there are these glimmers of hope, these acts of compassion.
Absolutely.
What specific examples are there of Tilly's courage?
Well, she displayed incredible bravery and compassion in the face of unimaginable suffering. She didn't shy away from the horrors of war. She comforted the wounded, helped with amputations, and even wrote letters for soldiers who couldn't write themselves.
Wow, she was practically a child herself.
I know.
And yet she showed such remarkable strength and empathy.
It really is a testament to the human spirit.
Absolutely.
Tilly's story, like Wes Culp's, reminds us that history isn't just about the generals and the battles. It's about the individual lives that are touched by these events, the stories of ordinary people who demonstrate extraordinary courage and resilience in the face of adversity.
So as day 2 comes to an end, the Confederates have failed to break through the Union lines. But they're not giving up yet.
Not yet.
They still believe they can win this battle.
That's right. Robert E. Lee is convinced that one more push will do it. He's got a plan for day 3. That will go down in history as one of the most audacious and ultimately tragic military maneuvers of the entire war.
All right, so we left off with the Confederates determined to make this one final push on day 3.
Right.
Robert E. Lee, despite those setbacks he faced on day 2, he is still convinced that he can win this battle. So what's the plan?
Well, Lee's plan for day 3, it was a bold but ultimately flawed gamble. He envisioned a 3-pronged attack that would strike the Union lines at multiple points.
Okay.
First, he would renew the assault on Culp's Hill, hoping to finally break through the Union defenses there.
Right. Culp's Hill had been a tough nut to crack for the Confederates.
Yeah.
What about the rest of the plan?
The second part involved sending Jeb Stuart and his cavalry on a wide flanking maneuver. Around the Union right, they were supposed to disrupt the Union rear, create chaos, and maybe even capture some much-needed supplies.
So a diversionary tactic to keep the Union Army off balance. What about the third prong of the attack?
Well, this is the one that's become almost synonymous with Gettysburg. Kickett's charge. Lee planned to send a massive infantry assault right into the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. He believed that if he could just break through the Union center, he could split their army in 2 and achieve a decisive victory.
Pickett's charge. You know, it's one of those moments in history that just sends chills down your spine. Thousands of men marching across an open field, directly into the teeth of Union artillery and rifle fire. It's hard to even fathom the courage or maybe the desperation that drove those men forward.
It's difficult to imagine. It was a scene of almost unimaginable carnage.
Yeah.
But before we get into the details of the charge itself, let's talk about the reaction to Lee's plan. Not everyone in the Confederate High Command was on board. In fact, Lee's most trusted general, James Longstreet, was vehemently opposed to the idea.
Longstreet. Old people.
Right. Longstreet was a brilliant tactical mind, and he saw the flaws in Lee's plan immediately. He argued that the Union position on Cemetery Ridge was just too strong, the ground too open. He famously said, "It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position."
Wow, and knowing what we know now about the outcome of the charge, that's a chillingly prophetic statement.
It really is. Longstreet pleaded with Lee to reconsider, to find a different course of action, but Lee was determined, and in the end, Longstreet, like a good soldier, obeyed his orders.
So the stage is set for this final dramatic act. Day 3, July 3rd. The sun rises on a battlefield that's already seen 2 days of horrific fighting. What happens next?
Well, the day begins with the Confederates launching their attack on Culp's Hill. The fighting is fierce, but the Union lines hold. Meanwhile, Jeb Stuart and his cavalry, They're finally in position for their flanking maneuver, but they run into trouble almost immediately.
They ran into a young George Armstrong Custer, didn't they? The same Custer who would later become famous at Little Bighorn.
The one and only. Custer, still a relatively junior officer at this point, led a spirited counterattack against Stuart's cavalry. He and his men fought bravely. They disrupted the Confederate advance and prevented them from achieving their objective.
So 2 down, 1 to go. The attack on Culp's Hill has failed. Stuart's cavalry has been neutralized. All eyes now turn to Pickett's charge.
Right, and while the fighting was raging on Culp's Hill, and Stuart's cavalry engaged the Union rear, Lee was preparing for that main event, the assault on Cemetery Ridge. He chose Pickett's division to lead the charge, believing that their fresh troops would be able to break through the Union center.
And so the order is given. Pickett's men, some 12,500 of them, line up for the attack. Can you describe what that moment must have been like?
Well, just imagine a sea of gray uniforms, stretching for almost a mile across an open field. The sun is beating down, the air is thick with smoke and anticipation. And then the order to advance is given. The Confederate line begins to move forward, slowly at first, then gaining momentum, marching in this relentless wave towards the Union positions on Cemetery Ridge.
And what about the Union response?
At first, there's an eerie silence. The Union soldiers hidden behind their earthworks. They watch as that Confederate line approaches. And then the silence is shattered by the roar of Union artillery, canister shot, exploding shells, just a storm of metal and fire tearing through the Confederate ranks.
It's like a scene straight out of a nightmare. What did Pickett's men do?
They kept coming. Despite the horrific casualties, they continued their advance. Closing the distance to the Union lines, the artillery fire subsided, and now it was the Union infantry's turn. Thousands of rifles erupted, just a deafening volley that ripped through those Confederate ranks.
And still they kept coming.
Some did. They reached the Union lines, a desperate hand-to-hand struggle ensued, but the Confederate attack had lost its momentum. They were outnumbered, outgunned, exhausted.
It was a massacre.
It was a disaster for the Confederacy. Of the 12,500 men who participated in Pickett's charge, over half became casualties. The attack was broken. And with it, Lee's hopes for a victory at Gettysburg.
It's a major turning point in the war, isn't it?
It is. The Confederacy would never fully recover from the losses they suffered at Gettysburg.
What about Lee?
It was a personal tragedy for him. He took full responsibility for the defeat, reportedly saying, "It's all my fault."
Wow, and what about the aftermath? The battlefield itself must have been a horrific sight.
It was a scene of unimaginable devastation. Thousands of dead and wounded lay scattered across the battlefield, a grim testament to the cost of war. The town of Gettysburg was overwhelmed. Homes, churches, even the town square were turned into makeshift hospitals.
It's a side of war we often forget about, isn't it? The impact on the civilians and the families, and the communities that are left to pick up the pieces.
It's an essential part of the story.
And as the smoke cleared and the armies moved on, what happened next?
The people of Gettysburg were left to bury the dead, care for the wounded, and begin that long process of healing and rebuilding.
It's in this aftermath, in the midst of all of this immense loss, that we get one of the most powerful and enduring speeches in American history, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
Yes, just 4 months after the battle, a ceremony was held to dedicate a national cemetery at Gettysburg. Edward Everett, a renowned orator at the time, he gave a lengthy speech, lasting over 2 hours, and then Lincoln rose to speak.
And he delivered this incredibly short but incredibly powerful speech.
Yeah.
You sent me an account of that day, and it describes how Lincoln wasn't even sure if the speech had landed.
I did. The crowd was initially silent after Lincoln finished speaking. You see, they were expecting a grand oration, something to match the scale of the battle and the sacrifice. But Lincoln's speech was so brief, so understated, that it took a moment for its full weight to sink in.
And then, what was the reaction?
Eventually, applause erupted. But that initial silence really speaks volumes about the power of Lincoln's words. He wasn't trying to be eloquent or showy. He spoke directly to the heart of the matter, honoring the sacrifices that were made at Gettysburg and rededicating the nation to the unfinished work of the war.
And that famous line, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth." It's become one of the most iconic phrases in American history.
It really has. It perfectly encapsulates the essence of Lincoln's message, a declaration of faith in democracy, a belief that even in the face of immense challenges, the will of the people would prevail.
So we covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Gettysburg. Strategic decisions, the personal stories, the aftermath, and of course Lincoln's powerful words. As we wrap up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important takeaway is that history is more than just dates and battles. It's about people, their choices, their sacrifices, and the enduring legacy of their actions. The stories of Wes Culp, Tilly Pierce, Joshua Chamberlain, and countless others, they remind us that even in the midst of unimaginable chaos and violence, the human spirit can endure, and hope can triumph.
That's beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the Battle of Gettysburg. We hope you found it as fascinating and thought-provoking as we did. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into history. We'll be back soon with another episode. But until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those questions coming.